So why do we obey the state? As I went through, so we could talk about lots of reasons for which the state evolved in the direction it did. Now, all this suggests there are two ways of looking at this. We either voluntarily accepted the role of the state, or we were stuck with the role of the state. So, among those who claim that we voluntarily accept the authority of the state, including Hobbes and Rousseau, we focus on the social contract explanation. In other words, we trade some rights and liberties in return for security. There's a consensus that this is in our best interest. Hobbes, who lived from 1588 to 1679, lived during the English Civil War in the 1640s. He rejected the single-handed God-given right to rule that was afforded to kings, but he also wasn't crazy about a parliamentary check on power. The equality of individuals was something that he espoused, but you need a sovereign monarch to rule at the end of the day, because the problem, according to Hobbes, is the state of nature. This comes out of Leviathan. The individual right to self-preservation means that life is, in Hobbes' words, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hence the social contract. We are self-interested, rational individuals, so we choose to submit to the authority of a sovereign, of a greater, stronger power, in order to be able to live in a civil society which is conducive to our own interests. This is all in our own interest. Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, saw the world in slightly different terms. People, according to Rousseau, are good. They're naturally equal. But as people have become more advanced, as they've been brought together in these communities, right, with specialization, all these sorts of things, we have increased leisure, and we see other people that are doing better than us. And these are the increasing disparities that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Some people have property. Others have work. And what this leads us to is a social pact, where people come together and they create a collective which is governed by a body that the people should somehow support. In other words, again, we cede some of our individual rights, and this is liberty, in the name of the collective goods we get out of the deal. We get protection. So, again, why do we obey? From a social contract, from a voluntary perspective, we obey because it's in our best interest. We'd rather give up some of our liberties and get more protection. Now, others see this as a much more coercive mechanism at play here. Karl Marx really epitomizes this, but there are plenty of others. And these sorts of actors focus on disparities between the rulers and the ruled. And they see the state and the political organizations as elite inventions that cause rather than resolve inequality. So coercion and extraction from the many is designed to privilege the few. If they come with guns and say, we'll protect you, well, we're going to say, hey, okay, that sounds pretty good. Right? It's not that we necessarily want to, but hey, they're the ones with the guns. Many aspects of the state do come off as coercive, but also somewhat necessary. What about taxation? I don't want to pay my taxes, but to pay for all the public goods we all need to thrive, I guess I'd do it. Would I do it if they didn't coerce me into it? I don't know. If there wasn't the threat that the tax police would come, would I still do it? Maybe. What about military conscription? Not something that we have in this country. Well, we haven't had it for about 40 years or so, although it's still on the books. But certainly in other advanced democracies and other non-democracies and other lots of different types of systems, you do have military conscription. Okay, so this is coercive. If you don't go to serve, you're going to go to jail. But, this is what protects us from other bandits out there, or from outside predators. Submission to the police. Okay, well, we submit to the police for the same reasons, for internal protection, to provide us from bandits within our own society. These complex political organizations gradually took root, though often there are vast areas beyond their authority, and there are many places where these organizations were much more simple. And we'll talk about the evolution of the state in Europe next, and then we'll talk a little bit about how it's evolved in Africa. But these are the two basic understandings for why we obey. One based on coercion, and the other, the social contract, based on this voluntary acceptance. So now the evolution of the state. And I should note from the beginning that much of the research on state development is Eurocentric. And this is a very important point. Much of political science, up until very recently, as I mentioned in the first day's lecture, has been very Eurocentric. So, the Roman Empire was a very complex political organization. It was also overstretched, and it was eventually toppled by rivals. Organizations disappeared, and roving bandits, what we had before the state, reemerged. And this helps to shed some light on what's happening in Somalia, where you've got the decline of the stationary bandit and the rise of the roving bandit. And again, go back to the first lecture if you're a little bit confused about stationary versus roving bandits. The Dark Ages from 500 to 1000 were a period of anarchy. Anarchy reigned. Communities shrunk inwards, where they had once reached out to one another. They had traded with one another. They had come up with agreements with one another. They now turned inwards, and everyone else became a threat. This was a this is a period of fragmentation, of instability, a very violent environment. And this led roving bandits to see profit in order. And these transformed themselves into what we call stationary bandits, with stakes in the territory, ready to fight off others. So again, a quick review. A roving bandit, these are basically people who want to control the population. But in order for it to pay off for them to control the population, they need to invest a little bit in the population. In other words, it's self-defeating to be a roving bandit, as we saw with the collapse of the Roman Empire. You have a bunch of people who go off and they take everything they can from a given territory, but then the people have no incentive to actually work and produce anymore. And so towards the end of the Dark Ages, we see this transformation of these elites into stationary bandits who have a stake in the territory, and they're ready to fight others off. The plunderers find profit in limiting their plunder. They say, hey, we won't take 100%, we'll take 80%, let you keep 20%, and now you've got an incentive to keep producing. So next, we've got the next phase of the evolution is the survival of the fittest, where adaptation means survival. Otherwise, you're eaten up by others. And here we're talking about these proto-state entities, and the city-states in particular. So this is a period of instability and competition, which leads to innovation and political and economic betterment. By the 1400s, and this comes out of Tilley's work, private businesses had led to the creation of separate and powerful interest groups, which the monarchs began to use. Europe was unstable. You had lots of small city-states fighting one another, these proto-state entities. And there was competition for trade routes, for territory. The rulers, these now stationary bandits, wanted to expand their city-state. They wanted to expand their entity. And they relied on capital produced by private businesses who came together in something called gelds, these organizations, in order to create standing armies. So they rely on the capital of private businesses to create standing armies. And this means increasingly they exercised taxation. But they also borrowed, which necessitated taxation from non-business types to pay back. So they would borrow from the rich business people, but then they had to tax the population so they could pay back these rich business people. As you had more and more expensive wars, as they went up in competition for these trade routes, for the territory, you had more and more expensive wars. And remember, others were also doing the same sort of extraction. You needed other organizations to get involved. You needed administrations to regulate, collect, and allocate the increasing flow of money. You needed courts and police to go after those who weren't paying their fair share. Now, the golden rule here is once the state starts collecting taxes and expanding the powers of the state, it doesn't tend to stop. It doesn't tend to retract. Okay? This is what's known as the ratchet effect. Very important term. Once the state grows, it tends not to shrink again. And this, of course, was fueled by going abroad and creating empires from which they extracted more from their new subjects and the goods they provided. So all of this in Europe eventually leads to the state, which is characterized by three advantages, this European state. First, this is a state where the rulers had a stake in the welfare of their citizens. The more their citizens earn, the more the state can take. What does that mean? It means we need to educate the citizens. It means we need to keep the citizens healthy, right? Not only providing hospitals, but also sewage, regulating horse traffic, car traffic today, right? So that people aren't sick, so that they aren't coughing, and so that they can go to work and earn. The more they earn, the more the state earns. The second point is that the state began to encourage technological innovation. It could be created by the citizens, but then it was used by the state. And this increased the wealth of the population and therefore of the state. Very mercantilistic. We'll talk about mercantilism in the next class. Third, there was an incentive for standardization. What the state was trying to do was decrease the cost of transactions between people. Make it easy for people to have transactions. Because the more trade there is, the more economic activity there is, the more people are going to profit, and then the state will profit. So the state facilitated travel. It created infrastructure. It created roads. It created bridges. The state facilitated communication. It created the dominance of a common language. It facilitated values so that people would have greater understanding for one another through the educational system. We all have common values. We don't cheat. We don't rob. It created some sort of identification with the state. Education helped do this. The creation of new state organizations to which all belonged. These are the sorts of things that the state became very good at. So, rulers developed a state and citizen welfare, the state promoted technological innovation, and the governments worked to standardize and facilitate intrastate and then eventually interstate relations as well. These states strengthened thanks to these traits, and this fueled military expansion and led to regional contestation for authority. As I noted before, they pushed outward, and this led to processes such as colonialism. And the state organization outlasted European dominance. In other words, newly freed societies, especially after World War II, newly created states that were used to be colonial entities, maintained these sorts of political organizations. They maintained the European template that preceded independence for them. Now, next, we're going to talk about a slightly different, well, really a very different understanding of the state and the evolution in Africa.